Well, to help us unpack Ramaphosa's options, I'm joined by Sean Muller, who is a senior lecturer in economics at the University of Johannesburg, as well as Sam Koma, who is the head of research at Mill Park Business School. Good evening to both of you, gentlemen.
Good evening.
Thanks very much for your time. If I must start with you, I don't know if any research has been done to actually look at how presidents tend to appoint their members of the executive.
Yeah, you're right. But if you were to use the BRICS trading partners as an international benchmark, you realize that if you take Brazil, it has a high population size of over 124 million, but they've got 24 ministers in the cabinet. You take India with a population of over 1 billion. The current Prime Minister has assembled a cabinet of 46 ministers. The same with Russia, with a population of over 200 million. They've got a cabinet size of around 25. So the President may consider such an international benchmark in the event he decides to trim the current size of the cabinet to 25 or 26. But also there's a precedent. If you take the former Mandela administration, it had a cabinet size of about 26, the same with the former Mbeki administration. So there is precedent, there is a framework that the president can refer to. Or you may even refer to the Trump administration. It's got 15 secretaries who are referred to as ministers in our context.
Mm-hmm. But that speaks more to the numbers, doesn't it? Sean, listening to Cyril Ramaphosa from that clip, he talks about demographics, he talks about age, he talks about, of course, he includes competency there, but he gave, the answer of a politician, because he has to weigh in these things, because all these constituencies actually have made demands. They have expectations about how his cabinet should look.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and I think the important point is that a cabinet is in many respects more a political matter than a technocratic matter. In a lot of discussion in South Africa recently, people seem to be confused between the idea of what a Director General of a department does and what a minister does. So, for example, some people say that the former Public Protector, Thuli Madonsela, should be Minister of Justice. And they say that because she was clearly very good at her job and very committed to her job. But arguably, that would make her very well qualified to be, for example, the DG of Justice, not the Minister. The Minister, the President can pick 2 ministers who are not actually MPs. But by and large, the majority of ministers and deputy ministers, the vast majority, have to be MPs, which means they have to come from the ANC. And what we've also seen recently with withdrawals from Parliament is that the ANC really seems to be taking people on the basis of their how far up they are on the list, based on the number of votes and nominations they got. So in that sense, it is a political matter. Of course, one doesn't want people who are corrupt or incompetent, and so far the signs are good that the President is moving in the direction of a better cabinet in that respect, but ultimately he has to send out the right message for himself as President and for his political party to the various constituencies, and also issues of gender representation and youth representation are not just political matters. There are substantive issues there. The only problem is that he's constrained by the MPs that he has.
But I don't think anyone can argue against, having people who know something, well, hopefully a lot, about the areas that they will be responsible for. If you had, as you have now, although it may not be a guarantee necessarily, that if you appoint a doctor for a Minister of Health, then you are going to get, the greatest health policies that you have. After all, the ANC does have good policies. Everyone seems to agree, but it's the implementation. But it does help to have someone who knows a lot about the area they're responsible for.
Exactly. If you take the economic cluster, trade and industry, you need someone with a technical background of global economic issues and also the economic constraints that faces the country, and to what extent can the government formulate sound, feasible economic policies to address these socio-economic challenges. If you take finance, my sense is that the current minister, Tito Mboweni, is likely to be retained for obvious reasons. You need policy uncertainty and also to address the market concerns. But he's got what it takes to be appointed in that ministry because of his professional background. He's an economist by background. The same with health. You need someone at least who's a medical practitioner or has a background of that particular field. Then you also go to other ministries. Justice, obviously you need a background of law to be able to persuade and also to address stakeholders who happen to be judges and also the legal fraternity that is comprising of very important stakeholders. So there are certain ministries where the issue of technical expertise and some knowledge of the field become crucial, especially for the president.
But of course, I mean, there are other people who argue that if you look at the record of people like Trevor Manuel, for example, who came from no financial background, but widely regarded as one of the best ministers we have had, not just finance ministers. So there is an argument to be made that if you surround yourself with the best talent you can get in the area you are responsible for, then that sets you up. All you need is to actually provide leadership. And then that can actually, I mean, Treasury remains, yes, we've had some incidents and stuff over the past 10 years in particular, but broadly speaking, I mean, Treasury has been actually very competent.
Right, and so I would take quite a different position. Yes, in principle, qualifications can help, but it depends very much on the personality of the minister. So in some cases, if a minister has qualifications in the relevant area, they're inclined to meddle. They think they know better than their officials, and they're inclined to interfere in the implementation of policy in their department. But if you look at, for example, many people think that Pravin Gordhan did a very good job as finance minister, and he was trained as a pharmacist. Some people have tried to use that against him in the context of being the Minister of Public Enterprises. For example, one discredited ESCOM employee has suggested that one should have an electrical engineer who is Minister of Public Enterprise. Now, that's absurd because the minister oversees all kinds of different state-owned enterprises.
Of course, if you saw where those comments were coming from, you wouldn't...
Right, so expertise is no guarantee of good governance, and vice versa. The critical thing is that, and this is one thing that in South Africa we haven't really dealt with, it was raised in the National Development Plan, and President Zuma, presumably because it's quite an inconvenient thing for him to deal with properly, largely ignored those recommendations. But we haven't really made a commitment to the separation between political authority and administrative authority. And there are different systems. For example, in the US system is quite different. When new politicians come in, they take out the top layer of the civil service. In the UK, on the other hand, at least until recently, you would have permanent secretaries, is what they're called. And so they would stay, and the ministers would come and go. But so long as you've got that solid department in place and good top officials, the minister doesn't necessarily have to have area-specific expertise, as you say, so long as they have the best talent and they allow them to do their jobs. And the minister plays their political role by representing them in cabinet and also communicating the party's own mandate to civil servants within the bounds of the law, of course, then that's what they should do.
Well, some has...
personally, I think we need to get to a stage where you have appointment criteria for some of these ministerial portfolios, because it can't be free for all. That as long as
prerogative thing doesn't really work.
You are popular within
no
the
president feels obliged to actually explain themselves, even when you see that some of these appointments are actually absurd.
Exactly. And also the appointment criteria or election criteria of the president. At some point we need to have a debate around that. What should be the requirements of one becoming a president of the country? So the constitution may have to be looked into in terms of flagging that particular criteria, because we can't afford to go back to the previous years where we had a lot of uncertainty, instability, and also a president who wakes up one morning and says, I'm exercising a prerogative, and announces a reshuffle.
Sean, I don't know, Sam did take his pick of sort of the ministers he reckons President Ramaphosa should focus on. Your choice of areas where he shouldn't compromise at all?
Right. I think So where the compromises might come in is appointing people who are maybe less than competent and less than committed to the public interest in order to satisfy factions within the ANC. The resignation of individuals like Nomvula Mokonyane and Mosuke Gaba from Parliament suggests that maybe that won't be necessary after all. But the one area where he really can't afford to compromise is ministerial appointments where the minister would have oversight of strategic institutions within the state. The Justice Minister, for example, the Finance Minister. If you think about it, the SARS, the Revenue Service, reports directly to the Finance Minister. We have important organizations like the Financial Intelligence Center that were targeted by the state capture faction. It's one of the reasons they wanted to remove the Finance Minister. So those strategic institutions, others like the President has appointment powers to some of those, like SARS, like the National Prosecuting Authority. But nevertheless, there is scope for certain ministers to interfere in the functioning of those appointments. So those ministerial positions are critical because in order to clean up the rot of state capture, we need those strategic institutions to do their work. So if there's one area where he absolutely can't compromise, it's those.
Maybe then, it takes us to a point, you raised earlier, that not only should we perhaps have a criteria for a person who should be president, but also look at the powers the president, but also the rest of the members of his executive have. Because, and I'm saying this on the back of what Cyril Ramaphosa did, which he was not obliged to do, because I'm reminded of this by the comments you've just made, where he selected this panel to actually start and conclude the process of appointing the National Director of Public Prosecutions. And on the other hand, when you see situations like what happened, what Lynn Brown is said alleged to have done at ESCOM, for example, you see the need to perhaps temper with the powers of a minister there. You look at the powers that a Deputy Minister of Finance has with respect to the PIC, that maybe this whole system does need a relook.
Yeah, exactly, a review, because also there are current developments in terms of shaping the political administrative interface, particularly between the ministers and their DGs and the other senior managers. So they're trying to design a workable template that will define clearly what are the responsibilities of a minister, which is basically to set a policy direction and also to set what needs to be the core business of that particular minister. But they're not involved in the actual implementation of those particular plans or policies. That is the jurisdiction of the DGs and the senior managers. So we'll see how that particular framework will be finalized, especially after the inauguration of the president and appointment of the new cabinet. But coming back to the executive powers of the president, interestingly, the former Deputy Chief Justice, Dikgang Moseneke, once raised the issue to say the manner in which the executive authority of the president was designed or framed, it was modeled around Nelson Mandela. And the understanding was that after Nelson Mandela, you'll have another Mandela who will be this defender and also this constitutionalist who's able to adhere to the provisions of the Constitution. So he called for the review of the executive authority of the president, given those challenges that we have faced as a country at one point.
From you, Sean?
Yeah, just to say that, so there have been discussions around the rationality of presidential appointments, and there were some court cases pending that then essentially became null because of Cyril Ramaphosa coming in and certain appointments being reversed. I think it is important to distinguish, though, between issues of competence that we were discussing earlier and issues of integrity, right? So I think we would agree that you can't have ministers who lack integrity, who are implicated in corruption, vested interests, conflicts of interest in certain key posts. But there has been an argument that maybe in order, even for people to be MPs, they should have certain educational qualifications. And I know that there are well-informed views on both sides, but I would say it's anti-democratic, because ultimately politicians are supposed to represent the populace. So once you start excluding people based on those criteria, I think that would be concerning. But we already have, the Constitution already allows us to exclude people from being MPs based on, for example, having been convicted for criminal offences. So it also, there's a certain natural sense in which that carries over to ministerial appointments. But just to come back to the point about Judge Moseneke's arguments. I think it was concerning when people were raising that because it seemed like they wanted to impede President Ramaphosa from cleaning up the rot, right? But what he's done now is set a good precedent with the powers that he has, as you say, to put together these advisory committees and act on the basis of those. But going forward, it may well be necessary to review those powers because we can't take for granted that we're not going to get another president like Jacob Zuma in the future who could essentially destroy the democratic order through his appointments.
There are many of those who may emerge within the ranks.
Thanks to both of you for coming through and sharing your thoughts with us this evening. That was Dr. Shaun Mala, a senior economics lecturer at the University of Johannesburg, as well as Dr. Sam Koma, who is the head of research at the Middle Park Business School.